While planning our wedding, my fiancé secretly married his ex for a green card and said, "We can still do ours, it's just paperwork." He used my budget, my venue, even my identity on her application. When I refused, he threatened to deport me from the country I was born in, then smirked. "You're replaceable." So I sent everything to immigration and watched them open the file marked fraud. I found out my fiancé was married to someone else 3 weeks before our wedding. Yeah, married. I was sitting on the couch surrounded by color-coded wedding binders, RSVP cards, and invoices when his phone started blowing up. Normally, he'd snatch it up right away, but that night he was in the shower. The name on the screen froze me, Uskus case status. Curiosity turned into confusion when I opened the text. "Congratulations, your marriage petition has been approved." Marriage petition. I scrolled and my chest tightened with every message. There were photos, my fiancé, Ethan, standing next to a woman in a courthouse, smiling like an idiot holding a marriage certificate. The date, 2 months ago, while we were still sending out our wedding invites. When he came out of the shower, towel around his waist, humming some stupid song, I just stared at him. "Who's she?" I asked, showing him the screen. His face didn't crumble. He didn't even flinch. He just sighed like I'd caught him lying about forgetting to take out the trash. "It's not what you think," he said. "Oh, I'm sorry, it looks like you married another woman for real while we're planning our wedding, so please, tell me what I'm missing." He wrapped the towel tighter around his waist and muttered, "It's just paperwork. She needed a green card, I was helping her, it doesn't mean anything." I laughed, but it came out shaky. "You used our venue deposit for that wedding?" He looked annoyed now. "Don't be dramatic, we can still have ours. Ours is real." That was when I noticed the application folder on the counter, his neat handwriting, my name and details listed as a secondary sponsor. He had used my identity to boost her immigration paperwork. My hands started shaking. "You used my name, that's fraud, Ethan." He stepped closer, voice low. "Watch how you talk to me, you don't understand how immigration works. You could get in trouble too if this goes public." And then, when I said I was going to call the police, he smirked. That disgusting, calm, arrogant smirk. "You're not doing anything. You're replaceable, you know that? You don't want to make enemies in this country, you might find it hard to stay here." "I was born here," I snapped. He just shrugged. "Mistakes happen in records all the time." That was the moment I realized something was very, very wrong with him. So while he slept that night, calm, confident, like he had me cornered, I sat in the living room with a cup of cold coffee, staring at a folder full of fake signatures, lies, and proof of everything. And I started planning. Not for a wedding. We met at a crappy open mic night in Logan Square, Chicago. He was supposed to be there to support a friend, but he signed up last minute and read this awkward, funny poem about pizza that made half the room laugh and the other half groan. I thought he was ridiculous and brilliant in the same breath. He bought me a slice afterward and told me he worked in logistics, liked true crime podcasts, and had a weird obsession with mid-century furniture. I thought he was flirting. He was. For the first year, everything felt like a movie montage, cheap concerts, Riverwalk walks, arguing about which deep dish place was actually worth it. He moved into my one-bedroom after 3 months. He called me in the middle of the night when his landlord threatened eviction. He learned my mom's weird coffee order before I did. I told myself I was careful, that I wasn't one of those people who fell too fast. Then he met my family for Thanksgiving and brought a plant. He was all smiles and promise. We started talking about forever before we'd even finished paying off the credit card from our first trip to New Orleans. I should have seen the first red flag when he dismissed my hesitations about long texts from a weird number as just spam. I should have seen it when he went out with friends and came back with excuses that always landed somewhere between plausible and hollow. But people hide things well when they want to. The man I loved was skilled at being invisible exactly where it mattered. My paperwork was always pristine. I've worked in municipal records for 10 years, property, birth certificates, voter registrations. I know how systems misbehave and how easy it is to hide something in plain sight if you know where to look. That's why being accused of anything relating to paperwork felt like a personal violation. I live my life next to forms and signatures. It's part of who I am. It's how I kept us afloat when wedding costs ballooned. I tracked vendors, negotiated payments, cross-checked contracts. Our budget spreadsheet was practically a baby. I had every deposit, every vendor contact, every refundable hold logged and color-coded. When I say he used our budget, I mean he used the spreadsheet I woke up to at 3 a.m. and edited so casually you'd think he'd been born wielding Excel. He was charming when it suited him. When we needed to save for a venue, he started cutting back on his coffee and eating less. He volunteered to talk to the venue manager to handle the deposit. He promised me the small things would add up. The wedding would feel intimate and expensive in the way that mattered. I believed him. Who doesn't want to believe the person who holds your ring and your future? Here's something else. He had a history, but not a violent one. Exes painted him as flaky more than cruel. I'd met one or two of them. They'd laugh nervously at the memory of how quickly he vanished when things got complicated. I didn't think that pattern applied to me. He became good at gaslighting in granules, making me doubt myself in ways that felt like erosion. Little by little, I let him take control of parts of my life that used to be mine without realizing I'd handed him the keys. And immigration? I was born in Chicago. My mother's side came through Ellis Island generations ago. I'd never felt threatened here. So when he started using the tools of the system, names, forms, my signatures in places they shouldn't be, it landed on me like betrayal and sacrilege. The idea that he would weaponize the very bureaucracy I respected felt obscene. The one thing I didn't expect was how calm he was about it. Not panic, not guilt. Just this clinical tone, like he was explaining a spreadsheet balance to a bored accountant. That calm turned my fear into something else, strategy. Because if he was going to weaponize papers, I could learn to weaponize them back. I started digging into the folders that night, the same way I'd audited a contract. I needed proof, and not the kind that exists in feelings, but the kind that sits in ink and timestamps. He thought sleeping meant safety. He was wrong. The next week was a slow burn nightmare. I couldn't bring myself to confront him directly at first, not fully. I needed evidence, timestamps, receipts, anything that tied him to fraud. Every night I went through our shared laptop, our emails, even our cloud storage. Every folder he didn't think I'd touch had bits of proof. Scanned IDs, copies of my signature, screenshots of the USCIS portal with his ex's name next to mine. At dinner, he acted normal. Smiling, commenting on centerpieces, talking about guest lists. He even asked if I wanted to finalize the seating chart on Saturday. I looked at him across the table, pretending to laugh at some joke about Aunt Carol's obsession with flowers, and felt bile rise. The man I thought I knew was sitting in front of me, living a lie so elaborate I could feel it radiate. I tried subtle questioning. Did you, do anything official for her? My voice was casual, but my hand was trembling. He laughed like I was joking. You mean Julie? Yeah, I signed a couple forms. It's paperwork, don't stress. We're still on track for our wedding. And then he dropped the threat I'd been fearing all week. You know, I could make things complicated for you. I wouldn't want to see you out of the country over something like fraud allegations. You'd hate that, right? I choked on my water. What the hell? I was a U.S. citizen, born here. Yet he said it like it was an open option, like he held the keys to my life. I stopped pretending after that. I spent the next few nights mapping every connection, emails, phone calls, receipts, deposits, text messages. I even found her social media accounts that confirmed she'd posted pictures of them at the courthouse. Every time he tried to normalize it, I added it to my growing dossier. The stress seeped into my sleep. I started sleeping with the folder under my pillow. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him smirking while someone else benefited from my identity. The betrayal wasn't just marital, it was personal, administrative, existential. Then came the turning point. I called USCIS on a vague pretext, asking how to report a potential fraud. The voice on the line was polite, procedural, and gave me instructions on how to submit proof. That call lit a fire. I realized I didn't just want to protect myself, I wanted accountability. I wanted him to feel consequences, the kind he probably assumed only existed in stories. Meanwhile, he was planning our wedding with the same arrogance. The venue deposit, the caterer, even the custom invitations, all handled by him, all under the assumption that nothing would touch him. I noticed a pattern. He loved control more than love. Every paper signed, every money movement, every RSVP confirmation was a mark of possession. I couldn't believe I had loved someone so meticulously manipulative. Every bit of charm he'd used to pull me in now felt like a weapon pointed at me. And for the first time, I realized just how replaceable he thought I was. He thought I'd fold. That fear wasn't going to make me compliant, it made me meticulous. By the end of the week, I had a stack of evidence thicker than our wedding guest list. I knew I could report him anonymously, but I also knew I wanted to watch the system react. I wanted him to see that the empire of lies he'd built so casually could crumble with one phone call, one submission. And then, just when I thought I had all the pieces in place, I found something that made me freeze. An official-looking notice that wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't from her petition. It was addressed to me, referencing a completely different fraud claim. Someone else. Someone I'd never heard of. And it had his handwriting somewhere in the margins. I stared at it, heart hammering. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Julie. He had done this before. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept staring at that new notice, tracing his handwriting, comparing dates, signatures, every tiny scribble. The more I looked, the sicker I felt. This wasn't a one-off. He had been doing this before, using other women's identities, signing their forms, getting them green cards, leaving chaos behind. I dug into the names on the notices, tracing addresses, old social media accounts. One by one, I found women who'd been married for paperwork years ago. Some had vanished from public records entirely. One had tried to fight it and got deported despite being here legally. He had a pattern: charm them, use them, erase them. And he was brazen enough to think I wouldn't notice. The next day, I confronted him while pretending to still be oblivious. I made a casual comment. "You've really helped a lot of people with paperwork, huh?" He laughed nervously, then smirked like he was proud. I wanted to vomit. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I could tell he was trying to read my expression. "Oh, nothing," I said, voice steady. "Just wondering how many lives you've touched with your generosity." He leaned closer, confident. "You don't need to worry about that. That's my business. You're lucky I even let you into my life." That smirk, that entitlement. I realized he wasn't just exploiting one person. He treated love like it was an experiment in control and legality. He didn't care who got hurt. He cared about leverage. That meant my entire reality, my safety, my identity, even my citizenship could be leveraged against me if I didn't comply. And then it hit me. He wasn't just a liar. He was a predator who used bureaucracy as a weapon. That smug, calculating charm, allure. I had been living inside his system without even knowing it. I couldn't just run away. I couldn't trust law enforcement to understand the layers of fraud without me having every detail in order. If I acted without strategy, he could ruin me faster than I could blink. I felt a cold surge of clarity. I had the evidence, all of it. His ex, my own documents, his emails, the notices from other victims. I had the power to put everything in motion and make him face consequences like he had never imagined. And that's when I decided I wasn't just going to stop him. I was going to make sure the world knew the kind of person he really was. It was time to plan, not a confrontation, not a fight, a takedown. I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open like it was a Bible I'd been betrayed by. The house smelled like reheated takeout and betrayal, and for the first time in weeks I felt steady. Not calm, not happy, steady. There's a difference. Steady meant I could think, and thinking was what I needed. First rule I gave myself: no impulsive theatrics. I'd seen too many revenge stories where someone rages first and regrets later. That wasn't me. I ran municipal records for a living. I knew how evidence reads. It doesn't roar, it sits in neat files with dates, metadata, and signatures. So I treated this like an audit. Everything had to be traceable, time-stamped, and defensible. Emotion would fuel me, but facts would win. I made a list, a cold, clinical inventory that looked nothing like the messy grief I'd felt the week before. Items on the list: copies of the marriage certificate with the courthouse stamp, screenshots of USCIS messages, bank transfers tied to the ex's name, emails where he'd written, "It's just paperwork," and a PDF of the vendor invoices he'd siphoned money from. I included the weird notice addressed to someone else with his handwriting in the margins. Most importantly, I wrote down the names of the other women whose records I'd found and the dates tied to their petitions. Pattern matters. Pattern is the sort of thing agencies pay attention to. Next rule: no solo crusade where I could be painted as bitter and obsessive. I emailed one person, a former client from my office who owed me a favor and owed me nothing in return, and asked for help verifying dates and running a few public record queries. I didn't explain everything. I said there were anomalies that needed a second set of eyes. He did the legwork I didn't have time for and confirmed my suspicions. The signatures matched, the timelines overlapped, and the mistakes were too consistent to be accidental. I drafted an anonymous tip to the fraud hotline first, just to test the waters, but I wouldn't rely on anonymity alone. I also reached out to an immigration attorney I found through a colleague, someone who knew how to read these cases without getting sentimental. We met for coffee. I didn't cry. I showed the folder. She asked precise questions that felt like surgical probes, and she didn't waste a second pitying me. That was a relief. She explained possible legal pathways, administrative complaints, law enforcement involvement, and civil suits if necessary, all of which required the evidence I already had. Hearing the word civil snapped something in me. This wasn't about punishment only. It was about making him responsible in ways he'd never expected. I also contacted two of the women I'd found, gently, through direct messages. I told them plainly who I was and what I'd discovered. Some didn't respond. One answered at midnight with a single line, "I tried to fight him. I lost my job, then my apartment." That message made it less abstract. These were human lives he used like chess pieces. While the lawyers and forms warmed up, I did practical things that weren't dramatic. I changed account passwords, put a freeze on financial lines that were jointish, and backed up every file to 2 different secure places. I pulled receipts from the caterer and vendor contracts and flagged the deposits he'd handled. None of it was glamorous. None of it was revenge porn. It was armor. I also started telling a small, trusted circle, my sister, my closest friend, my mom. They were furious and scared for me, and that fear fed me in a good way. Solidarity matters. It made the plan less like a private vendetta and more like a coordinated step toward accountability. Most importantly, I rehearsed how I'd tell the truth publicly if it came to that. Not theatrically, not for likes or pity. Exactly and only the facts I could prove. I imagined the look on his face when the evidence was laid out. Not smug, not defiant, but exposed. That image kept me awake some nights, not out of revenge fantasy, but because it felt like reclaiming what he'd tried to take from me, control over my life. I didn't want to ruin his life for sport. I wanted him to be responsible for the damage he'd done, to the women and to me. And so I planned with a calmness that felt almost mechanical. Gather, verify, consult, secure, then act. It was bureaucratic, yes. But if he'd weaponized bureaucracy, the least I could do was use it to cut him down to size. When the attorney asked me one last time if I was sure I wanted to go forward, I looked at the folder, and then at the man I used to think I could grow old with. "Yes," I said, "let's do it." I thought I had the whole picture. I thought the only lies he'd spun were mine and a handful of other women's. I was wrong. A week later, the attorney called me. She said something that made my stomach drop and my hands shake. "He's been under investigation for years," she said. "There's a federal case open, and you might be able to provide critical evidence. But it's not just marriages. There's tax fraud, identity theft on a scale that could land him in serious prison time." I blinked. "What? Are you serious?" She nodded. "Yes, and one of the women you reached out to, she's cooperating. She's part of a whistleblower program. They've been building a case, but they didn't have the full timeline you do." I felt a twisted mix of relief and horror. Relief because I wasn't crazy. Horror because the man I thought I knew had been living a double life that extended far beyond the green card marriage I caught him in. He wasn't just a liar or manipulator, he was a career fraudster. And he had assumed I'd never dig deep enough to see past the wedding. That night, I went home and looked at him across the kitchen table while he scrolled his phone, completely unaware. He was relaxed, even joking about how stressful wedding planning was. He had no idea that with the folder under my arm, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was about to hand him to the law, fully loaded with every piece of evidence he'd left in his wake. I realized something else too. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was justice, and it was personal. I started feeling a strange calm as I laid out the timeline for the attorney. Every transaction, every signature, every casual lie he'd told like it was nothing. They were shocked at how neatly everything fit together, and I felt a sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt since the first week I discovered his secret. Then I checked one last thing before submitting everything officially: the social security numbers, the dates of birth, the names used. And that's when I found it. One of the other victims he had manipulated wasn't just a stranger. She was someone I knew, someone who had lived in my building when I first moved to Chicago, someone who had trusted him and ended up homeless because of him. The realization hit me like a fist. This wasn't random. He'd been in my orbit for years, pulling strings in ways I couldn't have imagined, testing people, practicing his schemes. I was next in a long line, and the thought of how close I'd come to being just another footnote made my skin crawl. That's when I knew, if I didn't act, he could keep doing this and I would never forgive myself. By the time I left the attorney's office, I had signed off on the submission. Every email, every scan form, every note, every proof of manipulation had been sent to immigration, the federal investigators, and the whistleblower contact. I felt the cold, slow satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. I didn't tell him anything. Not yet. Not until it was too late. And when I finally opened the folder of submission confirmations, I stared at the PDF stamped with the words "Fraud Case Opened" and realized how small and human he suddenly looked on paper. I thought I knew why he did it. Greed, lust, some twisted sense of power. I was wrong. The attorney managed to dig deeper once I handed over everything, and what came out was worse. Ethan didn't just marry women for green cards because it was convenient. He did it because he liked the control. Not the control over money, not even the control over love, though he liked that too, but the control over existence itself. He enjoyed watching lives pivot on his decisions. Watching someone trust him, then folding like paper in a hurricane while he stood outside the storm, untouched. He'd done it before me, long before, with precision. Find someone vulnerable, someone pliable, and make them dependent on him. The green card marriages weren't about money or convenience. They were about seeing how far he could push reality, how far he could stretch the line between legal and illegal, trust and betrayal, life and ruin. And it gets worse. He had a checklist for it. He literally kept spreadsheets of women, noting their immigration status, credit score, family ties, even psychological weaknesses. Each new person was a project. Each successful manipulation earned him what he called stability points in his head. He thought of people like pieces on a chessboard, and my life had just been a particularly tricky move. He smirked when I refused to participate, and that wasn't arrogance. It was disappointment. I wasn't pliable. I wasn't just a pawn, I was a challenge. And in his sick mind, that meant I needed to be handled with threats, intimidation, and manipulation. That's why he pulled out the deportation line. That's why he stole my identity. That's why he thought he could replace me without consequence. Reading this made my skin crawl. This wasn't a man who made mistakes. This wasn't a man who acted out of passion or desperation. This was a man who treated human lives as instruments to play with. My heart broke in a different way now, not because he betrayed me, but because he had been building this pattern for years, carefully, methodically, like a chess grandmaster who enjoys the way the pieces crumble at the end of a game. I realized that nothing about him was accidental. Nothing about our relationship was innocent. My trust, my love, even the wedding I'd imagined, it had all been a performance for him, a test. And I had failed that test simply by existing outside his control. The knowledge didn't make me angry. Not yet. It made me precise. It made me surgical. Because if he wanted to treat lives as experiments, I would make sure that the consequences of his actions landed squarely on him. It was cold. It was horrifying. And it was the fuel I needed for the final step. When everything was filed and the confirmation emails pinged into my inbox, the house felt bigger and quieter than it had in years. I slept like someone who'd finally put down a weight that had been crushing her ribs. Not because it was over. Investigations are slow and ugly, and I knew that. But because for the first time since I found that USCIS text, I wasn't carrying the lie alone. The first real blow came 2 months later. I was at work, municipal records, same building, same fluorescent hum, when my sister texted a picture of the news alert. Ethan's name in the headline, federal indictment, identity theft, wire fraud. The list read like a cruel grocery receipt. I closed my browser so my coworkers wouldn't see my face. I sat alone in the stairwell and let myself exhale for the first time in months. They arrested him at the little rental he'd been using as an office. He tried to pull the classic charm, to talk his way out in front of officers who had seen it all, but there was no read-out-loud poetry, no awkward pizza poem defense that night. He was booked, photographed, and let out like the kind of man who had finally met a system that wouldn't be fooled by a smile. The women he'd used began to show up to hearings. Some had rebuilt what he'd smashed. Others were still picking pieces together. One woman hugged me after a court date and cried into my shoulder, swearing she'd never be the same, but thanking me with a gratitude that made my knees weak. That moment, a stranger whose life I'd somehow helped steady hit harder than any headline. The harm didn't disappear because he'd been taken down, but the weight of responsibility I'd felt became something else. Accountability made public visible, and for once, right. There were legal entanglements, civil suits, depositions where I repeated the same facts until my voice was gravel. My phone was a ledger of messages, from prosecutors asking for clarifications to reporters who wanted my side. I learned how to speak without venom. I learned how to be precise about what the law cared about and what I cared about. I didn't want to destroy a man for spectacle. I wanted him to answer for the lives he'd broken. The judge's gavel didn't heal anyone, but watching him lose the home he'd used as a staging ground felt mercifully just. Friends who'd been quiet came back. My mother stayed longer than she planned and brought casseroles and the kind of old-fashioned judgment that helps more than it hurts. My sister moved in for a while and reorganized my kitchen cupboards like she was rebuilding a life that had become messy. I dated terrible people for 6 months because grief and rage are terrible roommates, but I learned to laugh again in half measures and then whole ones. The last piece of closure was small and petty in exactly the way catharsis should be. He'd always mocked my taste in furniture and insisted his mid-century lamps were classic. After the auctioned assets list came out, I sat by a window in Logan Square and watched a photo from the estate sale scroll through my feed. His beloved lamp, sold for a fraction of what he'd bragged it was worth. Someone I didn't know bought it. Somebody who didn't know how he'd used the light to stage a life. I sent the buyer a single line. "It used to belong to someone who thought he owned people. It's worth less now." They messaged back a gif of a blinking owl. I laughed until I cried. I don't pretend this period didn't scar me. It did. I carry the aftershocks. A new lock on my door, a therapist's number I actually use, a refusal to sign anything without reading every line. But I also carry a file folder in a drawer that's labeled, in my handwriting, not mine. Sometimes I open it, not to relive, but to remind myself that the truth can be weaponized for good when used carefully. He's serving time now, the exact years less important than the fact that he can't use his charm anymore. He'll write angry letters from the bench, I'm sure. He'll try to spin the story for sympathy. Let him. I'll be at my desk, at my chosen job, the one that actually rebuilds real systems for real people, laughing at the idea that he ever thought paperwork could buy a soul. And if he ever thinks about me now, I hope he remembers one line more than any indictment. You can't forge someone's life and call it love, it's just bad literature.